The crown is slipping, the royal guard has shifted, and for the first time in her life, Camilla is looking at total, irreversible isolation. Honestly, it feels like history is finally delivering justice right before our eyes. This is the exact moment Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, utterly humiliates Camilla during a closed-door briefing at Windsor Castle, breaking 30 years of forced royal pleasantries. On Thursday, August 6, 2026, in front of the most senior members of the firm, Charles Spencer did what no one else dared to do. He bypassed the usual diplomatic whispers, stepped directly into the center of the room, and laid down an unredacted legal dossier linking Camilla to decades of calculated media leaks meant to tarnish Diana's memory. He didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke with a freezing, devastating precision that stripped Camilla of all her institutional defense. King Charles sat in stunned, paralyzed silence, while Prince William remained still like a statue, refusing to offer his stepmother even a single word of protection. But the true breaking point came afterward. Watching the ghosts of the past finally collide with the present, Catherine completely broke down, collapsing into tears away from the cameras as the crushing weight of years of hidden palace warfare finally fractured the room. Let's look at exactly how Diana's brother set this brilliant, inescapable trap. The atmosphere inside the Oak Room at Windsor Castle was thick with a suffocating, institutional silence. This was not a casual family gathering, nor was it a space where personal feelings were permitted to breathe. It was a closed-door briefing, a high-level administrative meeting intended to iron out the complex logistical and ancestral frameworks for an upcoming state occasion. The long, heavily polished mahogany table was flanked by the senior-most members of the institution. King Charles sat at the head, his expression masked by a lifetime of practiced neutrality, though his fingers tapped a restless, anxious rhythm against his gold fountain pen. To his right sat Camilla, adjusting her posture with a familiar, quiet assertiveness. For years, she had operated as the de facto gatekeeper of these proceedings, subtly controlling the flow of information and defining the boundaries of who was granted the king's ear. Across from them sat Prince William and Princess Catherine, both presenting a unified front of absolute composure. Catherine's posture was flawless, a masterclass in royal stoicism, yet the air in the room was undeniably charged with a freezing, unspoken friction. For decades, an uneasy truce had existed within these walls, a forced, highly managed pleasantry designed to bury the ghosts of the past for the sake of public continuity. But underneath the surface, the tension between Camilla's camp and the enduring legacy of Princess Diana had never truly dissipated. It remained a volatile, radioactive element in the family dynamics kept under lock and key by highly paid communications teams and strict internal protocols. On this particular afternoon, Camilla seemed intent on reasserting her dominance over the agenda, her voice carrying that low, measured tone used to dictate terms without appearing overtly aggressive. She was in her element, surrounded by the protective armor of palace bureaucracy, completely unaware that the structural foundations of her security were about to be systematically dismantled. The room was a pressure cooker of artificial smiles and rigid etiquette, waiting for a single catalyst to shatter the illusion of control. That catalyst arrived in a form nobody inside the room expected. Palace aides knew Earl Spencer had been summoned to provide the signature required for the state occasion, but they expected the paperwork to be handled outside the senior briefing. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open, breaking the strict protocol that governed senior royal assemblies. Aides did not announce the visitor. Instead, they simply stepped aside, their expressions frozen in a mix of panic and deference. Stepping through the threshold was Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer and the younger brother of Princess Diana. He did not walk in with the rushed anger of a man looking for a scene. He moved with a cold, deliberate precision that immediately shifted the gravity of the room. He was there under an ironclad, undeniable legal pretext, as the primary trustee of a historic, ancestral Diana Trust asset. The palace required his explicit signature and legal sign-off on specific land rights and hereditary permissions to proceed with the state event on the agenda. The required signature gave Earl Spencer a legitimate reason to be at Windsor, but entering the briefing with the dossier allowed him to bypass every administrative barrier Camilla's team had constructed. As the Earl approached the table, the temperature in the room plummeted. The pleasantries died instantly. King Charles stopped his restless tapping, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the sudden intrusion. Camilla's hand tightened perceptibly around her leather-bound notebook, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the man who represented the deepest, most uncomfortable chapter of her public life. William remained entirely still, his face an unreadable mask of stone, while Catherine's gaze drifted toward the heavy folder Earl Spencer held firmly under his arm. There was no greeting, no superficial exchange of titles, and no diplomatic deferral. The Earl did not wait to be spoken to, completely discarding the unwritten rules of royal hierarchy. He stepped directly into the clearing at the center of the room, looking past the king, looking past the future heirs, and fixing his gaze directly on Camilla. The trap had been sprung with absolute institutional coldness. Without a single word of introductory small talk, Earl Spencer placed the heavy, unmarked leather folder onto the center of the mahogany table. The dull thud of the paperwork echoed sharply through the high-ceilinged room, cutting through the remaining illusion of a routine administrative meeting. He didn't slide it forward. He kept his palm flat against the cover, anchoring it in place like a formal legal declaration. Camilla stared at the folder, her expression hardening, while King Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand instinctively moving toward the knot of his tie. "This is not a matter for the Privy Council agenda," Charles Spencer began, his voice devoid of any emotional tremor, carrying the freezing, detached precision of a seasoned barrister. "But it is a matter that ends today. What sits beneath my hand is a fully audited, unredacted forensic digital dossier. It has already been legally logged and securely duplicated with an independent external executor outside the United Kingdom. If the current trajectory regarding the revision of my sister's legacy continues, or if any further attempts are made to alter the titles and public boundaries of her grandchildren, this dossier will be released to the global press automatically, without further warning." The room grew so quiet that the faint hum of the Windsor estate's heating system became audible. Camilla attempted to break the paralysis, leaning forward to project her customary institutional authority. "Charles, this is entirely inappropriate for this forum, whatever personal grievances you have. I am not speaking to you as a peer, and I am certainly not here to debate personal grievances." The Earl interrupted, his tone dropping an octave, completely stripping away her royal title in front of the senior family members. He addressed her simply, directly, and with a cold finality. "I am speaking to you, Camilla." The deliberate omission of her title was a devastating institutional blow, delivered in front of the king and the future monarch. Camilla's face flushed a deep, tight crimson, her mouth drawing into a thin, rigid line. Earl Spencer opened the folder, revealing pages lined with chronological spreadsheets, encrypted communication logs, and verified metadata. "This is not gossip, and these are not rumors," he stated calmly. "What we have successfully mapped out is a multi-decade digital trail spanning from the late 1990s through to the mid-2010s. It details precise financial transactions, burner phone logs, and direct metadata linking your immediate personal staff and public relations confidants to specific tabloid editors." He turned a page, the crisp paper sounding like a slap in the dead silence of the room. "The data proves a systematic, calculated strategy of trading private, highly sensitive details regarding William and Harry's childhood vulnerabilities, their grief, their schoolyard struggles, and their private emotional states, specifically to secure positive press coverage and public rehabilitation for yourself. You bought your public acceptance using the psychological currency of 2 grieving children." The specificity of the claim was staggering. It wasn't an accusation of vague dislike, it was a presentation of rock-solid, legally verified corporate and digital forensics. The Earl pointed directly at a column of highlighted dates. Every time a negative story about your position surfaced, a deeply personal leaked headline about the young princes miraculously appeared 48 hours later to redirect public scrutiny. It was a targeted, weaponized campaign carried out by your inner circle, and the paper trail stops directly at your door. Camilla sat entirely frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked toward her husband, her eyes silently demanding that the sovereign intervene, but the sheer weight of the legal and public relations catastrophe detailed on the pages before them had already locked the room in a vice grip. The silence that followed Earl Spencer's words was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. King Charles sat completely paralyzed, staring at the highlighted spreadsheets with a look of profound, helpless panic. For a monarch, the ultimate nightmare is not an emotional outburst, but the presentation of cold, undeniable evidence that cannot be scrubbed away by a palace press office. The king looked down at his own hands, his fingers trembling slightly as the sheer political and historic weight of the dossier registered. He knew instantly that defending Camilla against this specific threat was an impossibility. To launch a counter-offensive against the Spencer estate would mean inviting a catastrophic public war that would permanently incinerate what remained of his reign's public support. The institution simply could not survive the revelation that childhood grief had been bartered for public relations points. Camilla turned her head sharply toward her husband, her eyes wide, silently demanding that the sovereign use his absolute authority to dismiss the Earl and seize the documents. But Charles remained motionless, caught in a devastating trap between his devotion to his wife and his duty to protect the survival of the crown. The king's silence was the first major fracture in the room's power dynamic, signaling to everyone present that his institutional armor had been completely pierced. Then, the focus shifted to the other side of the mahogany table. Prince William had not moved a single muscle since his uncle had entered the room. He didn't lean forward, he didn't sigh, and he didn't look at his stepmother. His hands were simply folded flat on the table before him. The true realism of the moment came from this calculated, strategic withdrawal. As the future monarch, William knew that his silence was the most lethal weapon in his arsenal. He looked down at the specific dates highlighted in the dossier, dates that mapped perfectly onto some of the darkest, most vulnerable moments of his adolescent life. He saw the digital forensics proving that his private pain had been used as currency to rehabilitate the woman who had replaced his mother. When King Charles finally managed to clear his throat, looking up with a strained, pleading expression to break the deadlock, he looked directly at his eldest son, hoping for a unified front. William met his father's gaze with a look of absolute ice. "William," the king murmured, his voice sounding thin and exhausted in the vast room. "Surely we can handle this through the standard legal channels. We must protect the integrity of the family." William did not blink. His response was delivered with a flat, terrifying calmness that cut through the last remaining threads of palace hierarchy. "The House of Wales will not be participating in any legal or public relations defense regarding this matter," William stated, his voice completely level. "No palace resources, no press officers, and no funding from my estate will be allocated to counter these findings. The data speaks for itself." With those few words, William effectively detached the entire future of the monarchy from Camilla's defense. He looked his father in the eye, signaling that if the king chose to stand by his wife in this battle, he would be standing entirely alone. Camilla's breath hitched, her face turning an ash gray as she realized that the future king had just stripped her of all institutional protection, leaving her entirely exposed to the Spencer ultimatum. Stripped of the king's support and facing William's absolute defiance, the veneer of royal decorum in the room completely disintegrated. Camilla, backed into a corner, attempted to launch a bitter psychological counterattack. Her voice, usually so controlled, trembled with a mix of anger and desperation as she leaned across the table. She didn't address the data. Instead, she targeted the vulnerabilities of the Wales family, making a sharp, veiled remark about the upcoming public schedules of the children and the heavy reliance on the palace's central protection apparatus to shield them from the press. Before she could finish the sentence, Earl Spencer shut her down. "Do not speak of my sister's grandchildren," he delivered, his voice dropping to a freezing absolute whisper that made the entire room completely still. "Your influence over the mechanisms of this family ends at this table. If a single negative headline regarding Catherine or those children appears in the next decade, the global press receives the unredacted master files within 60 seconds. You are entirely out of moves." The sheer gravity of the threat left Camilla visibly shaking, her mouth opening slightly but producing no sound. She was entirely neutralized. But the true breaking point of the afternoon didn't belong to the combatants. Throughout the entire grueling exchange, Princess Catherine had remained a statue of flawless, stoic perfection. For more than a decade, she had been the unshakable rock of the institution, absorbing the immense stress of ongoing palace warfare, maintaining a serene public smile, and protecting her children from the toxic undercurrents of the firm. She had swallowed her own pride, followed every rigid protocol, and acted as the ultimate peacemaker. But witnessing the raw, unvarnished exposure of how deep the manipulation had gone, and seeing the calculated betrayal of her husband's childhood grief, the psychological dam finally fractured. The sheer weight of the room became physically unbearable. As King Charles began to weakly call for an adjournment, Catherine rose from her chair with practiced grace, but her face was completely drained of color. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her and William, away from the eyes of the aides and the senior royals, they retreated into a private drawing room. The instant the privacy lock engaged, the mask shattered. Catherine collapsed into a chair, her hands flying to her face as she completely broke down into deep, chest-heaving tears. It was not a cry of weakness, but a release of pure, raw exhaustion from years of carrying the emotional survival of the family on her shoulders. William immediately dropped to his knees beside her, wrapping his arms around her tightly, his own face etched with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute fury as his wife sobbed quietly against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the terrifying realization that the palace war was far from over. The private drawing room remained cloaked in a heavy, somber stillness long after Catherine's tears had subsided. She wiped her face, her breathing slowing as she forced the flawless, unshakable composure back into her eyes. Beside her, William stood up, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute determination. There was no need for words between them. The boundary had been permanently drawn. When they finally stepped back into the corridor, the physical landscape of the palace had already shifted. The oak room had emptied with an eerie procedural efficiency. King Charles had retreated to his private quarters, visibly aged and utterly broken by the impossible choice forced upon him. Camilla was left standing near the tall windows overlooking the quadrangle, completely alone. No aides hovered nearby, no private secretaries hurried to draft a counter-statement. The silence surrounding her was institutional abandonment in its purest form. Her security detail remained, and her schedule would outwardly persist, but her actual authority within the palace walls had been entirely dismantled. She had been reduced to a historical footnote, stripped of the influence she had spent 30 years carefully cultivating. As Earl Spencer walked toward the grand exit of Windsor Castle, he passed Prince William in the long gallery. The two men did not stop to converse, nor did they offer any dramatic gestures for the hidden security cameras to record. Instead, they exchanged a single definitive nod, a silent alignment of the Spencer legacy in the House of Wales. The message was clear. The future of the monarchy had successfully detached itself from the old guard. The modern monarchy had fractured into two distinct realities. In one wing sat the king and queen, locked away in an isolated bubble of self-preservation, unable to use the machinery of the state to shield themselves from the ghosts of the past. In the other stood William and Catherine, entirely unified, fiercely independent, and unconditionally focused on protecting the next generation. The era of compromising for the sake of artificial unity was officially dead. The new guard had taken control of the narrative, ensuring that the legacy of Princess Diana would finally be guarded by the very children she died trying to protect. This brings a definitive, jaw-dropping end to a chapter the palace tried to bury for 30 years. Honestly, seeing Catherine finally break down shows the immense, crushing weight she has carried to protect her children from these internal wolves. But with Earl Spencer's ironclad trap now sprung, the old guard has officially lost its grip. Camilla is completely isolated. The king is powerless, and William has made it crystal clear that the future of the monarchy belongs to Diana's bloodline alone. It is a fierce, long-awaited reckoning that changes the House of Windsor forever.